September 30th, 1962. Another crisis flared in the ongoing American civil rights struggle. James Meredith, an African-American man, attempted to enroll at the all-white University of Mississippi.
I think Mississippi is the hardest of the hardcore segregationist states.
James Meredith applied to the University of Mississippi in January 1961, but was denied admission. With the help of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Meredith filed a lawsuit against the university, alleging racial discrimination. In September 1962, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Meredith's favor.
James Meredith had talked about taking on this whole barrier of white supremacy when he was a student at Jackson State. But it's a whole nother thing different in terms of filling out this application and then going through this entire process that he actually went through to integrate the University of Mississippi.
In the fall of 1962, Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett defied federal rulings and personally interfered with Meredith's attempts to register on campus.
He was a diehard segregationist, and he was militantly opposed to Meredith's entrance.
They say now they're enthusiastically supporting this platform, and they're going to integrate all of the schools by 1963. And that's something that we just can't take.
Governor Barnett and Attorney General Robert Kennedy reached a deal to allow Meredith to enroll. However, on September 30th, 1962, when Meredith arrived on campus, escorted by U.S. Marshals who were sent by the Kennedy administration, a racist mob was waiting for him.
So a full-scale riot breaks out, with the mob targeting the Marshals.
White mobs began lobbing bricks and acid at federal marshals stationed outside the university's Lyceum building. The marshals responded by throwing tear gas into the crowds. Amidst the chaos, Kennedy activated the Mississippi National Guard. The violence continued unabated for hours, and well into the early morning of October 1st, when federal troops finally arrived and crushed the riot. 2 people were killed, hundreds were wounded, and many were arrested during the riots. At last, on October 1st, 1962, Meredith was able to register for courses. He was the first African-American student registered at the University of Mississippi.
Kennedy was not by nature a big risk taker, but he was by nature a responsible leader. He was one of those that took a long time to make a decision.
You know, caution has its limits, and it can be incredibly problematic, but I think there is something to it that's important. Even when the stakes are intense and deadly and every minute counts.
Over time, Kennedy would learn the presidency could only be a tool for change if the one who held the office had the courage to act. Just weeks after the crisis at the University of Mississippi, the world was catapulted into the most dangerous chapter in its history. As early as August 1962, Director of Central Intelligence John McCone began to receive unusual intelligence reports. These reports described Russian ships transporting Soviet soldiers and technicians to Cuba, which was governed by dictator Fidel Castro. The Cuban coast was only 90 miles from Florida.
Many Soviet ships were crossing the Atlantic. That was, very obvious. We were tracking the ships, and it soon became clear that they were not just taking agricultural equipment and food supplies to Cuba, they were taking military equipment. And we picked up from electronic intelligence signals the fact that they were deploying an anti-aircraft system all around the periphery of Cuba.
On August 22nd, it was reported that as many as 20 Soviet vessels may have arrived in Cuba with military cargo.
These new shipments do not constitute a serious threat to any other part of this hemisphere. If at any time the communist buildup in Cuba were to endanger or interfere with our security in any way, or become an offensive military base of significant capacity for the Soviet Union, then this country will do whatever must be done to protect its own security and that of its allies. It is under our most careful surveillance.
And there's lessons we can take, even without romanticizing how perfect Kennedy was during this. One is the importance of deliberation. I mean, it is remarkable that the president in these moments of heightened crisis doesn't always act first. He thinks, he listens, he analyzes.
Had he been impatient, he would have gone with his first instinct, which was the first instinct of his advisors. But he looked at Khrushchev not as a madman, but as a fellow politician who has gotten himself in a pretty rough spot. And it is my job, Jack Kennedy, President of the United States, to help him get out of this place. And I need to do it patiently.
I think we were very lucky that it was Kennedy, because there's no question in my mind that whether it was Johnson or Nixon or Eisenhower, they would have invaded Cuba.
Kennedy was not convinced that a blockade would lead to the Soviets withdrawing their missiles. There was no reason to believe that. But he recognized, and that's what makes him such an interesting leader, he recognized that he had no better options.
A blockade could be considered a declaration of war, but Kennedy saw it as the best path forward. With the president's decision made and millions of lives on the line, the two most powerful countries in the world stared each other down at point-blank range. After days of preparation, including countless meetings with his brother Bobby, Ted Sorensen, and other close advisors, Kennedy decided it was time to address the nation as the country prepared for a full-scale nuclear war.
In terms of how dangerous the situation is. And at this point, we were at one step from going to war.
On the evening of October 22nd, Kennedy sat behind his desk in the Oval Office, surrounded by cameras and members of the press. Finally, he spoke.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. My fellow citizens, let no one doubt that this is a difficult and dangerous effort on which we have set out. Many months of sacrifice and self-discipline lie ahead, months in which both our patience and our will be tested.